Hello and welcome to part 3 in the series on how to analyze, design and draft a V-neck inspired pair of evening pajamas, which are a pair of fully flared, silky, lovely trousers at the front, which then become a skirt at the back. But the magic is that the trouser leg in between your legs just wrap around like this, and the whole trouser pattern is actually one piece, and the fabric as well, which brings on challenges, but it gives it that real glamour. And you can imagine that in any sock, it'd be fantastic to wear. The order of construction is really fun, but before we get into that, I'm also going to show you what to consider when cutting out the pattern, because that's actually the hardest bit, just because it's so big. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to make it. And if you have always wanted to have that skill of being able to look at an image, analyze it, and then design and draft your own clothes from it, then do have a look at the link in the description. You can learn to do so with me and join me in a really nice private pattern cutting schools, where you can learn all the skills and knowledge you need to draft the clothes you'll want to wear every time. And now let's have a look how to actually stitch up these pair of evening pajamas. Let's start with the good news. Making this pair of trousers or skirt is really straightforward. You cut out your pattern once. However, the size of it is really the biggest issue. So sewing it is straightforward. Cutting it out in fabric is going to be tricky. In the last video I talked about how I would stitch lengths of fabric together and lay it out on the floor. However, I think working in silk, that'd be a nightmare. I've changed my mind as soon as I saw how big of a pattern actually is. Sometimes it's hard to imagine it. I realized you have to go the other way. So rather than having one big pattern on a massive piece of fabric, I would piece this together. So I would cut this pattern up and add seam allowance to my cut lines, and then cut it out as bits and pieces. And that's of course what I've done on the half scallop trial on the mannequin. So you want to have your cut lines with the straight of grain, because that's where it's really easy to stitch together, and in the silk especially, you don't want to have any off-grain seam. Let's start with actually working out what is visible. So of course this is visible. So we don't really want any seams in this section at all. And the same sort of goes up to here. That's all visible. So we don't want to have too many seams if possible. What the original had, which makes sense, is to have one seam where your side seam would be. And that's just because it's a natural place for a seam. It won't stand out too much. You know, you wouldn't want to have it going halfway your front, or you know, somewhere in your back. In your back it would sort of be going across. So your side seam is a perfect seam. So I would have my first seam here. And that's also of course where you could then put in your zip. That piece would be exactly the width of your fabric for an average height person, of course. So if you're, for example, taller, what you might end up doing is adding a second seam here. So I would probably then draw a line parallel to my side seam, because I know that's my straight of grain, like that. And then I would add a second optional seam here, because that is all hidden. You don't see, you sort of see it, but it's not at first obvious. And again, you would add notches here, and then you can piece it together, stitch it together before you make the garment. So that piece is sorted both for average sizes and taller or narrower widths. I think if you think about, that's your inner leg here. So as long as this seam stays anywhere here, it's not as visible. This is still the massive pattern piece. On this pattern piece, we've got one seam there. On the original V-neck book, they added a second seam there, which is really visible. I know it's sometimes done on purpose because it looks, you can see it's special, it's bias cut, whatnot. If you have a seam there, it doesn't look bad. So if you wanted to, you could just have a seam here, for example. And then you would have, again, you have this, which is, again, the width of your fabric for a average height person. However, what I was thinking, and I don't know why I didn't do it, I would literally continue the line, which means, yes, you have it going at a funny angle to your back crotch, but it's not visible as such. So I would have another patched piece there. So I've got one big piece like that, like a half moon, and then I have a separate piece there, and that would work for most heights, I think, because we got a little bit of wiggle room here. But of course, if you need, you could still cut it off. But I would start off by having a seam here, and then if you have to have a second seam there. So that's all the hard work done, because once you've decided where you want your seams to be, you cut it along there, you cut out each piece separately, and then you just stitch them together. So you end up again with a single piece. Just don't forget to add your seam allowance when you splice them up. Once that is done, the sewing is relatively straightforward. I'm going to show you on the half scale, which I made knee length, of course, for the mannequin. So I've sort of had to try to force it in, but these are our two curves like that, our crotch lines. So on the smaller piece, it looks like that. So I've got the two crotch lines. Like that, and that's what I have to stitch together first. So you can see I've got my piecing pieces here, but what I do is I just hold my crotch lines together like that, and I'm going to stitch them like that. Choose your finishing as you want. At this point you can also add your dart on one side and your side seam. On the other side seam, of course, if you've pieced it together like I did and you net it, you have a seam. I've left it, I've stitched all the way up, but of course that's where you would insert your zip, or you could also do some sort of hook and eye closure, because you have another layer underneath. So in theory you could just have a hook and eye, but I think that might gape open, so I would put an invisible zip in there. I think on the original what they've done is just a series of tiny poppers or hook and eyes, and you could do it because as long as it's sort of if it's loose, some poppers might be enough, or hook and eyes. Otherwise an invisible zip will be really nice. Or even just if you, because of course you piece it together, you could actually just add a facing piece, like a lapped overlap, and then you probably just get away with having your buttons on the waistband or a tie, for example. That'd be really nice as well. Choose whichever you want to, but put in the dart on the other side. Of course she inserted the gussets, so if you're using the gussets you would do it this step as well. You of course will have a gusset on this side as well, and then one side of your gusset would be your zip. What we need to do is basically turn it inside out and attach it to your waistband. So I'm actually going to put my hand through here, and then of course this is my front, my center front here, and this is my center back. So these two actually get stitched together. So you need to find your center back notch on the dress part, and you line that up with your center back on your trousers here, on your crotch, and I'm holding it together so all the seam allowances are facing upwards, and then I'm turning it up. And this is how I'm gonna pin it before I show you. This is how the dress is going to look, or the jumpsuit, or whatever you want to call it, pair of trousers. You can see that's actually how it's going to look. We have our trousers here. I haven't fixed this on yet. And then, of course, on the back, we've got our full skirt. All you now need to do is fix on the side where you have your dart. You line up all your different layers. So I'm lining them all up. So the edge of my inner wrap goes all the way to the center front again. So it can be lined up. And it can be lined up here as well. And it might be because it's not a perfect circle. So you might have different circle shapes. So some might be more on the bias and some less. So it's worth putting a few more notches on the full scale as well, so you know how everything sits together. But these all go together. Then on the other side, so again, starting with my center back, I again pin the outer and inner layer, so the inner wrap and the outer, together. But this time you would only pin it together until you come to your zip. And at that point you would, on the inner, that needs to stay loose, and of course that gets attached with a little hook and eye later on. So you would either have to notch it there and then fold it down so it's out of the way. But what you can do once you've done that is you attach your whole waistband. Your waistband of course has a side opening here, so whichever waistband you choose, you stitch it all the way round, making sure you don't attach just one side of your inner front wrap. You can choose whatever waistband construction you want for this, and of course if you have a bodice it would be attached to the bodice. And it's actually really easy to stitch because I started stitching to one side of what would be my zip. I stitched the front trousers first and we stitched all around, and you just stop on the other side of the zip, and that way it's guaranteed you don't catch the other side of the wrap. And that's it. That's your trousers ready to try on. And that's the series of Viennette trousers, skirts, evening pajamas finished. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you enjoyed the watch. And if you make them, do let me know. I'd love to see them. I dream of having a reason to make a pair of evening trousers like that. I can just imagine that in a really fluid silk crepe in like a really rich color, and either as a jumpsuit like original, or a separate pair of trousers and a little top, and just feeling very glamorous but also really comfortable. So let me know in the comments if you make it. Of course, as always, I would love a thumbs up, and thank you so much for watching.